the recent one, Why CRM Sucks, was very popular. But this webinar is almost revisiting fundamentals. The title, as you can see, is Your Salespeople 4 Appointments a Day, 5 days a week. So what I'm going to be doing in the next hour is revisiting really the fundamentals of sales process engineering, or perhaps fundamentals is an overstretch. What I'm doing, what I'll be doing, is showing you the most basic application of sales process engineering. So if you've attended other events, you've heard about the implications for CRM. You've heard how we build inside sales teams and customer service teams. This is the most basic application. You know, what we do in environments where there are field-based salespeople, and probably the most popular application of sales process engineering. So it's a big call, 4 appointments a day, 5 days a week. That, of course, is a significant improvement in productivity. As I'll mention on a couple of occasions, a typical salesperson, and it doesn't matter really whether we're talking about organizations in the US, in Australia, in New Zealand, or even, I believe, Latin America, certainly the UK, a typical salesperson is doing 2 true business development appointments a week, almost regardless of the industry we're talking about. So to increase a salesperson's activity level from 2 business development appointments a week to 4 a day, 5 days a week, a total of 20 a week, is a 10 times increase, an order of magnitude increase in salespeople's productivity, and that's what I'm promising you, so I hope you'll hang around to find out exactly how it's possible, and more importantly, why salespeople aren't doing that currently. So I want to start with 2 questions, and these 2 questions are a nice segue into some of the very critical theory that I want to start with, but they're also a check. If you can answer yes to these 2 questions, then there's a very high likelihood that my promise actually will ring true in your organization. In other words, it will be possible for you to get your salespeople, or at least some of them, doing 4 appointments a day, 5 days a week. So here are the 2 questions, and I'll get you to use the little plus and minus icons that you discovered a minute ago. The first is, do you have unutilized production capacity? And the second is your production, is your market share less than 20%? So if you can answer yes to both of those questions, and give me the little plus sign. You'll find the icon in the window on the left-hand side in the middle of your screen. So here are the 2 questions. Do you have underutilized production capacity? So production capacity that you're paying for but not selling. And is your market share less than 20%? So let me see those. Alejandro has his hand up. Do you have production capacity that you're paying for and not selling? And is your market share less than 20%? Okay. Well, yeah, there we go. I'm seeing yeses from pretty much everyone there. So the interesting thing here is not those questions. Those questions are fairly unremarkable. The interesting thing is the conclusions that we can draw from your positive answers to those questions. So let's get stuck into the conclusions. If you answered yes to those 2 questions, I can draw 2 conclusions. The first is that your organization has growth potential, which I guess is good news. And the second is that your constraint is sales, which, unless you're familiar with theory of constraints, is probably a curious statement. So let's attack these in that order. My first claim is that as a consequence of your answer to those questions, you have growth potential. So that would appear to be obvious, but what may not be obvious is exactly how much growth potential you have if you answered yes to those 2 questions. So here we have a chart, of course, and on the vertical axis we have sales, on the horizontal axis we have time, and the line I'd like you to focus on is the yellow dotted line in the middle of the screen, and that line represents your production capacity. Now, if you're a manufacturer, you're more than familiar with the concept of production capacity, and you probably know what your capacity is in terms of units a day or units per month. But if you're a knowledge work environment, the notion of production capacity is just as relevant. Because the reality is that you are paying every month when you write checks for payroll for knowledge workers, no doubt. And your production capacity is the average output, or the maximum sustainable output of those knowledge workers. So it doesn't really matter whether you know what your capacity is exactly to the unit. But the fact of the matter is that you are likely to have finite production capacity, and you are likely writing checks every month to pay for that production capacity. Of course, once we recognize the existence of capacity in its finite nature, then the second most important question is, well, what's your current utilization of that production capacity? So for most organizations, the utilization line looks something like the shaded area underneath the production capacity on the chart there. And of course, there are two conclusions or two observations here. One is that the utilization is consistently less than the production capacity. And the second is that the utilization is quite variable. Now, I know that I've done a good job drawing these lines like this because, of course, the first question that I asked you is, do you have unsold production capacity? So, of course, looking at this chart, it's obvious that this is not a positive situation because you're paying for production capacity every month that you're not selling. Now, the obvious question is, well, why is that? And, of course, the obvious answer is, well, it's the market. We're in a recession or a downturn of some kind, after all. So let's add to this chart and add a third line that represents the marketplace. So look where I've drawn that line. I've drawn that line way above your production capacity. In fact, I've drawn the line here that represents the aggregate demand, the aggregate market demand for your products or services. I've drawn it so far above your production capacity that even during, downturns here, global meltdowns perhaps, even though market demand for your products and services drops, it never drops so low that it impinges upon your production capacity. So how do I know that I can draw that line up there? Well, it's quite simple. I think most of you answered yes to the question, is your market share less than about 20%? If your market share is a small fraction of the aggregate market demand for your products and services, it's fair for me to assume that the market demand, no matter how badly it drops from time to time, will never drop so far that it impinges upon your production capacity. Now, if that's the case, the obvious observation here is that if you are selling less than your production capacity today, the marketplace is not to blame. Okay? The marketplace may be a contributing factor. Obviously, when times are tough, it makes it harder for you to sell. But the state of the market, if your market share is less than 20%, is not in and of itself an explanation of why you are selling less than your current production capacity. So in order to understand the full reason why, we need to proceed to the second observation, the one that was less obvious. And this observation is that sales is your current constraint. So for those of you who are TOC aficionados, this statement makes absolute sense. But for those of you who aren't, let me explain. So I've got a system here drawn to represent your business. And the system consists of two functions, the sales function and the production function. So obviously, this is a model of your organization. It's a gross oversimplification, but I think it's enough to get the point across here. So if you think about the job of the system as a whole, the job of your business, it's obviously to make money. And the way that you make money is you process work in progress of various types through this little workflow here, or through these two resources. So we take opportunities, we prosecute those opportunities, attempt to turn them into sales, and if we turn them into sales, then we take those orders and we process them in production and we exchange them for cash. So that is the essential nature of the machine that we call our business. Now, of course, this machine as a whole has finite capacity, and the capacity of the machine as a whole is a function of the capacity of these individual components, the production component and the sales component. Now, it's unlikely that each of these components has identical capacity. So that leads us to ask the question, well, if the generation of money is being constrained at one location within the system here, where is it being constrained? Is it being constrained by production's inability to process orders, or is it being constrained by sales' inability to generate orders? Now, in most cases, the answer is the latter. It's being constrained by sales' inability to make orders. And of course, your answers to the questions, those two relatively innocuous-looking questions I asked a minute ago, now it makes it clear that in most all of your cases, your organization's ability to make money is being limited by the capacity of the sales function, the ability of the sales function to produce orders. Now, this is a curious situation because, and probably an unfortunate situation, because if we think about where most of your owner's equity is invested in the business, whether you're a listed company with public shareholders or whether you're a private company and it's your money, perhaps. If you think about where the owner's equity is invested, it's likely that most of it is invested in the production facility, not the sales facility. Now, if that's the case, you would think, if your objective is to generate as much profit as possible, which I hope it is, that it would make more sense to run the production function at 100% capacity and have spare capacity in sales than it would to run the sales function at 100% capacity and fail to fully utilize that production capacity. So a more desirable state for most businesses, not all businesses, there are exceptions, software companies like Microsoft, where their unit production costs are essentially zero, are an exception. But in most organizations, it makes significantly more sense to configure the organization like this. So we have a finite amount of production capacity. We deliberately ensure that we have more sales capacity than we have production capacity, which means that sales can sell everything that production has the capacity to produce and more. Now, if you imagine that you were in that situation, and you imagine that you were to build your organization today and to set it running today, press the start button, and you imagine that everyone in the organization worked as hard as possible. Sales would produce orders, production would fulfill them. But because the sales function had more capacity than production, over time you would end up with a queue of orders, unfulfilled orders, starting to form in front of production. Now, at some point, you would observe that queue was starting to reach unhealthy proportions, and you would tell sales to slow down. And you would tell sales not to stop selling, but to focus on maintaining the size of that queue of orders upstream from production. Of course, the result of that is that production would continue to operate at 100% utilization week in, week out, month in, month out. And what you have just done is, assuming your organization is a typical one, is maximize the financial performance of your firm. Okay. So here's an interesting test that you can apply in your organization to determine where your constraint is. So go and find your sales manager today and ask your sales manager a very, very simple question. Here's the question. The question is, why does your role exist? And listen very carefully to their answer. Now, I tell you what's going to happen. Your sales manager is probably going to look at you quizzically, as if you asked a really dumb question, and then give you the obvious answer, and that answer is going to be, well, my role exists to make sales. So you can ask for more clarification at that point. You can say to your sales manager, well, how many sales? Again, I suggest your sales manager is going to look at you quizzically, as if you're truly daft, and then he or she will give you the obvious answer again, which is as many as possible. Now, at this point, you should scratch your head and reflect on what that answer really means. What that answer is really indicating is that you have probably done a fairly poor job of designing your organization. Because if your organization looked like this diagram that you're looking at on the screen right now, that would not have been your sales manager's answer. If your sales manager was operating in this environment, the one we're all looking at, and you were to ask your sales manager that question, why does your role exist? Your sales manager would clearly not say to generate as many sales as possible. Your sales manager would say, well, to maintain the queue of forward orders upstream from production. Okay, so build the environment correctly, and your sales manager will give you the appropriate answer, and you'll notice a dramatic difference in the day-to-day functioning of and the financial performance of your firm. So this is all aspirational stuff. The important question is, how do we get here, and what relevance does this have to the promise of today's webinar, which is your salespeople, 4 appointments a day, 5 days a week? Well, here's the thing. What we're recognizing, I hope, is that most of us need to increase dramatically the capacity of our sales functions to the point where we have more capacity in sales than we have capacity in production. Now, increasing markedly the capacity of your sales function is probably a vexing challenge, because you've probably been experimenting with ways to achieve that for some time, whether or not you understood the enormity of the problem. And the most obvious approach to solving that problem, of course, is to employ more salespeople. Now, here's a rhetorical question. What happens when you employ more salespeople? You would assume that when you employ more salespeople, you automatically make more sales, because salespeople produce sales, do they not? I wonder, is there anyone in the webinar here who has actually attempted to increase sales by increasing the size of the sales team. Now, of course, it works well if you don't have any sales team at all. If you have no sales team and no sales, then increasing the size of the sales team will surely cause the emergence of sales. But what if you had 3 salespeople, or 5 salespeople, or 20 salespeople, and you doubled the size of the sales team? Do you think, based upon your experience, and you can use the little plus or minus here, do you think, based upon your experience, doubling the size of your sales team is going to cause your volume of sales to double? What do you think? No? 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 Okay. That's the answer I typically get. In most cases, the suggestion that doubling the size of the sales team will cause sales to double is preposterous. That question or that suggestion uh, um, elicits a round of laughter from around the room if I'm presenting in a live seminar. But that's kind of curious, isn't it? Because if we were in a production environment, let's say we were a printer, and we had a big 5-color Heidelberg sitting at the back that was churning out printed sheets, and we discovered, for some reason, perhaps sales won in enormous order, that we needed to increase the productivity of the printing, increase the output of the print room significantly. Let's say we needed to double it. It would be clear to us that to double the output of the print room, assuming that Heidelberg was running at full utilization currently, we would actually have to go out and buy another one. Now, if we went and bought another printing press, if we invested $1 million or $2 million or whatever it cost in a new printing press, we would expect that we would double the output of the print room. And I don't think that would be an unrealistic expectation. And we'd make damn sure that if we did go and invest in that Heidelberg, that we did double the output of the print room. But sales is quite a different animal. Most of us have an implicit understanding of the fact that the sales function in its current form won't scale. And the most concerning thing, there's 2 concerning things about that. One is that we're aware of it, at least implicitly, and the second thing is that it doesn't keep us awake at night. It really should. So I could spend a whole hour talking to you about why sales functions won't scale, but I'm not going to do that, because after this event, in the email you get straight away afterwards, I'm going to, as promised in the opening, send you an extract of the first 3 chapters of my upcoming book, The Machine, and that tackles that subject in detail. But let me give you 2 suggestions as to why sales functions don't scale. The first suggestion is that in most organizations, salespeople don't sell. If you look at how salespeople spend the greater majority of their time, most of their time is spent doing things other than selling. As we acknowledged at the beginning, a typical salesperson does 2 business development appointments a week. That's about 10%. 8% is the official number. But that's about 10% of their capacity dedicated to selling. The rest of their time is spent doing stuff. In most cases, that stuff is important, oftentimes even critical to the organization, but it ain't selling. So one of the reasons why you can't expect to double the size of your sales output when you double the size of your team is that salespeople are not selling. What they're doing most of their time, or for a significant proportion of their time, is tending to existing accounts. So if your sales team is spending most of its time tending to existing accounts, processing orders that would have come in even if those salespeople were on vacation, and you double the size of your sales team, obviously you don't double instantly the number of existing accounts that you have. So the end result is that you have a whole bunch of salespeople sitting around idle. Now you could think to yourself, well, that's a positive thing, because if they're idle, if they're not occupied with existing accounts, then they can jump on the phone and generate a bunch of new accounts. But there's one more problem. And that problem is that salespeople, for the most part, do not generate their own sales opportunities. In other words, salespeople don't originate the opportunities that ultimately turn into sales. Now, it's true that some salespeople prospect. Most of them don't like to do it, but certainly some, many perhaps, prospect. But if you were to go and do an analysis, an autopsy on the opportunities that your salespeople have been prospecting over the last 6 months and track them back to their origin, you will discover something quite horrifying. And that is that very few of those sales opportunities have actually, if your organization is typical, been originated by the salesperson. Most of those opportunities emerge in spite of, not because of, salespeople's prospecting activities. And in answer to the question, the obvious question, where do those sales opportunities come from? You probably guessed the answer already. Most of the sales opportunities that salespeople spend their time prosecuting on the small number of occasions that they are actually engaged in business development come from existing accounts in the form of either inquiries relating to repeat purchases or referrals. So when we consider that salespeople for the most part aren't selling, and when they are, for the most part, they're not selling to opportunities that they generated, it becomes quite easy to see why doubling the size of the sales team is unlikely to double revenues anytime soon. So this leaves us but one option if we are still serious about increasing the capacity of the sales team, or the sales function, which I hope you are. And that option is to improve the productivity of the sales function. Now, I left that option till last because it's not a very appealing option for me to present to you because it's almost insulting. In other words, we've already acknowledged so far that you need a significant increase in the capacity of your sales function, a significant increase, not an incremental increase. And now I'm suggesting to you that you can't get that increase by increasing the size of the sales function. You can only get that increase by increasing the productivity of the sales function. So what, in effect, I'm suggesting is that your sales function must be hideously unproductive if you can create a significant increase in output just by improving the team's productivity. If I was to take a stroll around your production facility and suggest to you that you could double output just by improving the productivity of your existing infrastructure and your existing resources, you would probably find that suggestion fairly offensive. But here's the thing. There is significant upside, significant opportunity to increase the productivity of a typical sales function, a modern sales function, for one simple reason, and that is that a modern sales function today looks exactly how a manufacturing function would have looked about 100 plus years ago. In other words, a modern salesperson is an artisan operating in a craft shop environment. So my use of those two words, artisan and craft shop, are quite deliberate. If we were to trace back the history of manufacturing to prior to the Industrial Revolution, somewhere there we'd reach a point in time where manufacturing was done by individuals, by artisans. And what that means is that individuals would have been responsible for the entire end-to-end process. So if we're talking about a cobbler, curiously the word cobbler hardly exists anymore. It's almost extinct. Now the reason the word cobbler is almost extinct is because it's very, very rare nowadays anywhere in the world to find single individuals who make shoes. But of course, cobblers at one point in time existed. And of course, what cobblers did was literally make shoes, everything from killing the beasts to tanning the hides to cutting to sewing, the entire end-to-end process. So why am I telling you the story? Well, the fact is, if you go and examine a typical sales function today, perhaps even yours, what you're likely to discover is that salespeople are artisans. They are responsible for the entire end-to-end workflow, everything from turning over rocks looking for people to sell to, right the way through to prosecuting opportunities and turning them into sales. But actually, in comparison to manufacturing, the situation where salespeople are concerned is much worse. We assume casually that their responsibility is sales. But the reality is, in most organizations, salespeople are responsible not just for winning new accounts, they're responsible for maintaining them thereafter. And most organizations are careless enough to make no distinction whatsoever between the acquisition of new accounts and the maintenance of existing ones. Now, the interesting thing about the maintenance of existing accounts is that salespeople, in most situations, make very little contribution to the maintenance of existing accounts. Now, we don't know that because we know that when our clients' salespeople go on vacation, the orders continue to come in. And we also know from experience that the primary determinant of whether or not customers reorder has nothing to do with the relationship with the salespeople, even though salespeople swear to the contrary. The primary determinant of whether or not your existing customers will reorder is your operational performance. In other words, two things determine whether or not they reorder. Number one, do you deliver on time, in full, without errors? And number two, how does your product perform relative to your competitors, taking into account its functional attributes and taking into account its price? So in other words, and interestingly, when you present this claim to salespeople, they never argue with it, in spite of the fact they simultaneously claim that your clients transact with you simply because of their relationships. So the thing is, if you want to keep customers, the key to keeping customers is to sell them a superior product, cheaper than their competitors, cheaper than your competitors, and to deliver on time, in full, without transactional errors. If you do both of those things, you will retain your customers. What salespeople should be focusing on is winning new accounts. So here's a situation we've bastardized the definition of the word sales to the point where sales now includes not just winning new accounts, but managing those accounts thereafter. So the consequence of that is that salespeople are artisans. They're responsible for an end-to-end workflow, as I've suggested, but that workflow doesn't end with the winning of an account. It is an endless workflow, meaning that every time a salesperson wins a new account, they go on to become the interface between your organization and the customer in perpetuity. It's not hard to see now why I'm claiming there's significant upside potential. Now, I'm making this claim, of course, in the context of manufacturing. Well, I'm contrasting sales with manufacturing for good reason, of course, because in the last 100 years or so, we have seen massive increases in productivity in manufacturing environments, measured using whatever yardstick you wish. And of course, those improvements in productivity have been a direct consequence of manufacturing moving away from the artisan model or the artisanal model, or moving away from the craft shop environment. And production environments, manufacturing environments, have become more productive the further away they move from the craft shop environment, until very recent times when we start to experiment with cellular manufacturing and so on. But if we examine the broad scale, the further we move from the craft shop environment, in other words, the more we industrialize, the higher the output and the better the quality. Okay, so maybe we're onto something. An interesting thought experiment, if nothing else, is to ask ourselves, well, what is the root cause of the massive increase in productivity that we've seen as a consequence of this industrialization thing that's been going on in production environments? But hang on, it hasn't just been going on in production environments, has it? It's been going on in production environments, in finance environments, in engineering environments, in project environments, in fact, in every environment within the organization except for the sales function. Every part of your organization, with the exception of sales, has essentially become industrialized. So the essence of industrialization, you've guessed it already, is division of labor or specialization. Division of labor is the fountainhead that has caused the massive improvement in productivity and quality we've seen over the last 100 years or so, and division of labor has found its way into every part of the modern organization except for sales. Virgilio is asking, how can we set standards of productivity in sales? Well, but the same as you would in any other environment, you'd contrast output with effort. In other words, inputs versus output. So you would look at a revenue or throughput, or revenue or contribution margin generated per man hour, perhaps, or per payroll, or relative to payroll cost. Return on payroll, in other words, would be the most obvious productivity measure. Okay, so what I want to talk about now is how we would, should we wish to, apply this idea, this magical idea of division of labor to the sales function. And the first stop in this discussion is to recognize explicitly that division of labor in production environments and in project environments has not exactly been smooth sailing over the last 100 years. It has obviously taken us 100 years to get to the point where we can look back today and congratulate ourselves on just how clever we are in our ability to execute this industrialization thing. The history of industry suggests, however, that it didn't come easy. So it's very important that we don't forget the lessons learned by our forefathers. And we need to remember, in particular, that an environment where we apply division of labor becomes a very fragile thing. And there are some critical prerequisites that have to be in place in order for us to be able to exploit the enormous upside potential of division of labor. So in other words, if we don't have these prerequisites in place, we end up making an enormous mess, and you'll see why as I explain the prerequisites. So the first prerequisite is standardization. It's impossible to apply division of labor without first having standard workflows. Now the reason for that is obvious. With division of labor, we have a much more complex routing. By routing, I mean the journey that work in progress follows as it moves around your organization. So work in progress in a production environment would be raw materials, or would at least start as raw materials. In a sales environment, the work in progress would be sales opportunities, or perhaps potential customers, in a more general sense. So when we apply division of labor, the workplace becomes more complex. The routing that raw materials follow through that workplace becomes more complex. And in order to have a reasonable chance of managing that complexity, we need to standardize workflows such that two similar products in a production environment follow the same path through the organization, and such that in a sales environment, two similar opportunities follow the same path through the organization. Now, I'm not going to belabor standardization because most of us have an understanding of what it is and have almost an instinctive awareness of the importance of it. So standardization is the first prerequisite. The second one is the critical one, and that is centralized scheduling. So remember, a synonym for division of labor is specialization. So when we're talking about division of labor, what we're talking about is going from a situation where we have generalists responsible for an entire workflow to having specialists responsible for a single activity or a group of activities of a similar type within that workflow. Now, when we get to that end state, when we have a group of specialists each working on their own set of activities, what we end up losing is anyone in that environment that has an awareness of the workflow as a whole. Okay? And as a consequence of that, it becomes necessary for us to add a special person into that environment called a scheduler. Now, the role of the scheduler is to be the eyes and the ears of the specialists, in the sense that because the specialists no longer have that, what we would call today, 360-degree awareness of the functioning of their environment, that becomes a responsibility of the scheduler. So it becomes a role of the scheduler to determine or to manage the routing of work through the environment such that the specialist can focus on discrete activities. And in any environment of any complexity where we apply division of labor, it doesn't matter whether it's a production environment, whether it's a project environment, whether it's an orchestra or an airport. In any environment above a critical level of complexity, when we apply division of labor, we must centralize scheduling. In other words, the very first specialist, when we apply division of labor, must be the scheduler. Now think about a sales environment and think about who in a modern sales environment is responsible for the schedule. And think about if you have experimented with division of labor in sales in the past, would it be fair of me to assume that the very first specialist was a scheduler? So that's a fairly radical suggestion, because what I'm suggesting is that if sales is no different from any other environment, if we want to apply division of labor to sales, we must convince salespeople to give up ownership of their calendars. And they must be prepared to give ownership of their calendar to someone else. And that someone else must assume responsibility for scheduling all of the activities that occur within the sales function. So that's a pretty radical suggestion. And of course, that is exactly what I am suggesting. And I'm not suggesting that it's a nicety. What I'm pointing out is that because sales environments, particularly ones where you have people operating in the field, are reasonably complex environments, and salespeople will be happy to stress to you just how complex sales environments are, or their environments are, the complexity makes it a necessity, not a nicety, that if we wish to apply division of labor, we must separate scheduling from the performance of activities. Now, if you want a more graphic example of how important it is to do that, and an example that's probably closer to a sales environment, consider a project environment. Consider an environment where a group of individuals were building a high-rise apartment complex. I wonder what individual in that group makes the biggest contribution to the success or failure of the construction project. I'm sure all of you would agree that it would be the project manager. Now, it may well be that the project manager is not the most experienced nor the best paid person in that group. I'm sure in that group there are subcontractors who earn millions of dollars a year, where our poor project manager perhaps only earns $90,000 or $120,000 a year. There are a lot of people in that group who have significantly more experience than the project manager, but all of the members of that group will willingly subordinate to the project manager. In other words, all of them will willingly allow somebody else to own their schedule and to allocate to them discrete activities because they understand that they could not operate effectively in any other environment. In other words, If we imagine a project environment without a project manager, what we're no doubt imagining is plasterers closing up walls before the electrics and the plumbing are installed. Okay, it's easy to imagine the chaos that would ensue. The third requirement is a formal management regime. So this is a very interesting point. Virgilio asks, what do I mean by a formal management regime? Here's what I mean. Now, what we actually need in an environment where we have division of labor is management. So the only reason I'm saying a formal management regime is to draw a clear distinction between what we see in sales environments and what I actually mean by management. If you show me a manager in a traditional sales environment, I will show you someone who is anything but a manager. They aren't a manager. They can't be a manager because of the fact that you cannot manage an individual or a group of individuals who operate autonomously. It's an oxymoron, a contradiction in terms. If you think about it, the role of manager emerged in industry immediately after division of labor. And the reason why we have a requirement for management after division of labor is exactly the same reason we have a requirement for scheduling. And in fact, the responsibility of the manager and the responsibility of the scheduler are very closely aligned. So in most organizations, scheduling becomes a discrete function. But really, the role of the manager is to coordinate the performance of the environment, both internally and externally. And by externally, I mean coordinate the performance of the production environments with the other parts of the organization, or in the case of sales, to coordinate the performance of the sales environment with marketing and with production and with engineering and so on. Now, in a typical sales environment, we have people called managers, but they are not managers in any intelligent sense of the word because they have neither the information nor the control that is actually required for someone to be a manager in a legitimate sense of the word. So what I'm suggesting here is if we were to apply, if we were to transition to the model that I'm suggesting here, we need a completely new take on management. And managers need to transition from being kind of, amateur counselors to being proper managers in a formal sense, just as we would see production managers in a production environment. In other words, managers need to step up and take responsibility for exactly what team members are performing on a day-to-day basis, exactly what activities are being performed on a day-to-day basis. Okay. So that's enough with the theory. Let's talk about the practical implications of all this. So I've talked about four important concepts. Division of labor, of course, and I've talked about standardization, the centralization of scheduling, and I've talked about a formal management regime. Let's explore each of them in a more practical sense. So, division of labor. The case for that is obvious. As I pointed out before, a typical salesperson spends just 8% of their time engaged in face-to-face business development appointments. The rest of their time is spent doing other stuff, most of which isn't performed in the field, and most of which could be easily performed by other people, and in most cases performed better by other people. So if salespeople aren't selling, what are they doing? Well, they're performing customer service, they're assisting with fulfillment, that includes helping to design solutions, they're involved in the management of opportunities, so the logistics associated with opportunity management, most of which involves the scheduling of appointments. And they're also involved in clerical tasks, data entry in the CRM, fulfilling literature requests, and so on and so on. They engage in social activities in the vain hope that those will generate sales opportunities, and they are prospecting. In most cases, they're not, but in many cases, or in some cases at least, they are. The interesting point is that most of those activities can be allocated elsewhere, and if allocated elsewhere, will be performed better and will result in a better functioning organization. So let's break them into three groups or four groups. So all of those activities, I've broken them here into four groups. There's the business development meetings, those critical face-to-face meetings out there in the field. Of course, my suggestion is that we have our salespeople do them and do nothing else. Now, as I mentioned at the outset, the upshot of that is that we essentially increase the productivity of our salespeople by 10 times. So let's just reflect for a minute on the magnitude of that. What that means is if you had 10 salespeople today, those 10 salespeople, instead of doing 20 appointments a week, would be performing 200 appointments a week. It also means that you could reduce your sales team from 10 people down to one person, and one person could do the same volume of appointments that 10 people are currently. Now, that in itself is an interesting idea, because what that would enable you to do is to pick your best performing salesperson and have that salesperson perform all of the appointments that your entire team is currently performing. If you want to select an option in the middle there somewhere, a more realistic approach is to say, well, let's reduce the sales team from 10 down to 2 people. We'll pick our 2 best salespeople, and a team of 2 salespeople in this model could perform twice the volume of business development appointments that your entire team is currently. So that's a fairly attractive proposition, assuming, of course, which I think is a fair assumption, that sales appointments actually cause sales and not salespeople. It doesn't matter how many salespeople you have, if they're not out there in the field talking to people, the existence of salespeople is not going to magically cause the manifestation of orders. Okay, so if we take sales and give it to salespeople and give everything else to others, we're left with 3 sets of activities: administration and clerical. Now, of course, if we take administration and clerical activities and give them to admin/clerical people, they will do a better job of them. It's not hard to claim that, because most salespeople do a terrible job of them. In fact, the quality of salespeople's performance of clerical activities seems to be inversely related to their effectiveness as salespeople. The better they sell, the worse their data entry. Promotions. Now we can take promotions away from salespeople and give that to someone else as well. Now, increasingly, with the changes we're seeing in technology in particular, promotions is becoming something that salespeople are less and less capable of doing. Nowadays, effective promotion requires, websites. It requires online promotion, whether it's SEO or more commonly pay-per-click advertising. It requires landing pages, reasonably sophisticated CRMs, clever people doing analytics, and it requires webinars, an example of which you're participating in at the moment. Now, salespeople are ill-equipped to do any of those things. And certainly they're not in a position to do any of those things well, even if they have the technical capability, and some of them do. It makes a lot more sense to take all of those activities and give them to a dedicated promotions team. You will generate significantly more opportunities per dollar of payroll than you will if you have your salespeople doing it. The last group of activities is customer service and fulfillment-related activities. And the trick there is to take, particularly where customer service is concerned, to take those activities and give them to a dedicated customer service team. Salespeople think they do a good job of customer service. The reality is salespeople expend incredible effort to generate or to provide terrible customer service. Now, the problem here is not that they're ill-intentioned. The problem is that they're ill-equipped and inappropriately resourced to be good at customer service. If you imagine that you're a customer with an issue, you have 2 requirements. The first is that you can speak to someone about it immediately, and the second requirement is that the person who you talk to about your problem can effect a solution immediately. Salespeople fail on both counts because A, they're not available most of the time, and B, if they are available, they're nowhere close to operations, and as a consequence are incapable of effecting a solution on the spot. So the issue is not that salespeople are ill-intentioned, they are ill-equipped. The key to solving this problem is to build out your customer service team so that it's robust and capable. Ensure that customer service takes full and absolute ownership of every customer service issue, and then and only then insist that every single customer service issue is routed to customer service. So the way that we teach salespeople to do this is if they're in an appointment attempting hopefully to sell something new, and the customer mentions that they have a problem with a past order, the trick is to have the salesperson call a customer service team member on their cell phone, put their cell phone in speakerphone mode, upend it on the table, introduce the customer to a CSR, a customer service representative, to sit there patiently while the customer service representative takes the details of the problem, enters it into the CRM, and promises to provide the executive with updates. I guarantee that that will only ever happen once. After experiencing a far better way to report customer service issues, what you will discover is that your customers will never report them to the salesperson again, because they will discover that if they report them directly to customer service, their issues get resolved far faster and with far less friction than would otherwise be the case. Now, there is one more part of this division of labor thing that I need to pay some attention to. I wonder, can you put your hand up or show me the plus sign again if your environment is a complex sales environment? So for those of you who are manufacturers, if yours is an engineer-to-order environment, and even if you're not a manufacturer, there are still many engineer-to-order environments, like software environments, for example, or consulting environments. So I see a 1, 2, 3, 4, 4 hands up there. Okay, so engineer-to-order environments are a special case. And the reason they're a special case is that it is impossible to have a perfect handoff between sales and production. So for that reason, division of labor appears to make no sense. So I want to show you how you can still apply division of labor in an engineer-to-order environment in spite of the fact that you cannot have a perfect handoff to production. So if you were selling something simple, Coca-Cola for example, sales could be out there in the field taking orders, and they could flip those orders direct to production, and they could move up to the next appointment absolutely confident that production understood the order with no opportunity for ambiguity. But of course that isn't the case in complex sales environments. In complex sales environments, above a certain level of complexity, perfect handoffs between sales and production are impossible. Now, impossible doesn't mean very difficult, it means not possible. So if it's not possible, the trick is not to attempt it. Now, if it's not possible to have a perfect handoff, if there's always implicit knowledge that is never transferred properly, what ends up happening in a complex sales environment, put up your hand if you've experienced this, is salespeople, after they've won an order, have to chaperone that order through production, because they know that if they don't, there will be production problems and the customer will end up getting something other than what they were expecting. I see a couple of hands raised there. Okay, so the good news is if your salespeople and production work like this, if sales and production essentially operate in parallel, it's good for delivery quality. You know, it's more likely that customers are getting what they ordered, but there's an enormous cost in structuring sales and production like this. Number one, all that time that salespeople spend in production is time that they don't spend in the field. Number two, the other problem is that if salespeople go out in the field and win orders and then take those orders into production without any prior involvement of a production representative, what tends to occur is when they try and jam those orders into production, those orders are met with some degree of skepticism. You know, production people will say, well, you promised what and when? How confident are you that we're actually going to deliver that? So what ends up happening is the tension that always exists and probably should exist between sales and production ends up being resolved post-sale, which is not good for customers, it's not good for the profitability of your firm, and it's not good for the psychological welfare of your production people. So there's a trick that enables you to apply division of labor without enforcing a handoff between sales and production. The trick is to add a new role called a project leader. Now, I'm not suggesting adding new people. What you will find, and we'll talk about this in a moment, is that many of your existing salespeople actually will make better project leaders. So the project leader is a person who spans the entire client engagement. They engage during the sales part of the engagement to take the customer, to do the client's requirement discovery. They are responsible for solution design, and they hang around post-sale to chaperone the job through production. So what ends up happening during the sales part of the engagement is that we essentially split the sales part into two components. There's the technical component, which is the project leader's responsibility, and then there's the commercial component, which is the salesperson's responsibility. So what happens is salespeople and project leaders sell together. The salesperson has the technical conversation, the project leader has the salesperson has the commercial conversation, the project leader has the technical conversation. Now, the result of that is that when the sale occurs, when the contract is actually signed, the commercial discussion stops. The salesperson is no longer required, they disappear, they work on prosecuting another opportunity elsewhere. Of course, at that point, the customer has no interest in continuing to talk to the salesperson. They, of course, want to talk to the project leader because there is nothing that is more important to them than ensuring that their project traverses your production workflow and provides them with the deliverables that they're expecting at the other end. So there's nothing more valuable that we can do when we work in a complex sales environment, an engineer to order environment, than to show organizations this model. It really is magic for organizations. Now, it may look like it's reducing productivity because we have more people involved in sales, but the reality is that we're freeing up a massive amount of salespeople's productivity as a consequence of this, and in most cases, salespeople are actually more expensive than project leaders. So it makes a lot of commercial sense. Okay, so with that in mind, let's talk briefly about the prerequisites for division of labor. The first one is a standardized workflow. Now, I don't need to spend much time on this because you all know what standardization looks like. What I have here is a chart of what a workflow one of our clients might design would look like. And you can see that we have different resources here, and we have a formal workflow, a formal routing, as production people would say. So we know that every opportunity will follow exactly this routing. Now, if an opportunity, it is possible for an opportunity to enter, halfway along this routing, but every opportunity moves through exactly the same path. Okay, and that is simply a requirement for division of labor. Now, the interesting thing about this is salespeople will often argue that they need flexibility, but if you look at your salespeople and look at how they prosecute their existing opportunities, what you will discover is that your existing salespeople process similar opportunities identically already. They just don't think they do. They take their clients on exactly the same journey every single time. The interesting thing, however, is that different salespeople take clients on or potential clients on a different journey, and that surely doesn't make sense. Presumably, there is an ideal workflow. Now, if you have salespeople, a bunch of salespeople prosecuting opportunities differently, all that diversity does not cause greater innovation, it causes lesser innovation. Because unless you have a common standard, you cannot iterate around that standard. Now, I learned this lesson when we came to the US. We had a workflow when we came here that required me to go and do face-to-face appointments with lots of potential accounts. So when I first moved here to LA, every Sunday night I used to drive to Los Angeles Airport, LAX, and get on a plane and fly east. And I'd start off in Chicago or Atlanta or New York, and I would spend all week, every single week, traveling from city to city, doing appointments, and then I'd fly back home at the end of the week. And it was, I was effective doing that. We generated sales. But as time went on, I started to discover that I couldn't be in the same place at the same time, and I ended up running meetings in the form of conference calls as opposed to physical meetings. And when we look back at our statistics, we discovered that conference calls were just as effective as face-to-face meetings. So as a consequence of that, we were able to modify the workflow and completely eliminate face-to-face meetings. I haven't done a face-to-face meeting here in 2 years. So now all of our preliminary meetings are telephone-based meetings. And the only time I jump on a plane and fly anywhere is to conduct a solution design workshop, which is a paid engagement. Now, we would never have discovered this if we had 4 or 5 salespeople all prosecuting opportunities differently, because if we didn't have a standard workflow, we never would have had opportunity to sit down and ask the question, well, how can we improve our workflow? Because there never was a standard workflow to improve. So that's a very important point. Okay, the next point is centralized scheduling. I stressed previously that it's important that if we apply division of labor in an environment that's complex, we have to centralize scheduling. So the way that we do it in sales environments is very, very simple, and interestingly, there's a precedent for it in most organizations. If you think about a senior executive, a chief executive in a medium size or a large organization, it's highly likely that that executive will have an executive assistant. And it's highly unlikely that that executive, after working with an executive assistant, would ever want to go back to not having an executive assistant. Now, if you think about what an EA is, an executive assistant, they are essentially a project manager. Think of it this way. The chief executive is a valuable individual with lots of demands on his or her time. Competing demands, a limited amount of capacity. So the chief executive gets for himself or herself an executive assistant. The executive assistant takes ownership of the various initiatives that the CEO is prosecuting. And the executive assistant also takes ownership of the chief executive's calendar. So when the EA owns the initiatives and the calendar, what the EA can then do is to schedule discrete activities in the CEO's calendar, and the CEO, instead of worrying about the calendar and the initiatives, can simply move from activity to activity, perform those activities, and after performing each activity, go on and perform the next activity. That is exactly the way that we structure field sales. So in the environment that I'm advocating, every field-based salesperson has a dedicated executive assistant. We call them sales coordinators, but the important phrase here is executive assistant because sales coordinators are executive assistants in every sense. So what I mean by every sense is that the executive assistant owns the portfolios of opportunities under management and owns the salesperson's calendar. Think of it another way. What we've essentially done here is taken a salesperson and figuratively sliced them down the middle. Because if you think about it, any field-based salesperson spends a good percentage of their time in a home office, or perhaps in your head office, doing the necessary office-based work that's required to generate their field-based activities. So they're updating the CRM, they're making calls, etc., etc. All we do is split the salesperson, figuratively speaking, into two, and the field person does all of the face-to-face appointments, and the head office-based person, the executive assistant, manages the opportunities and does all of the scheduling. In other words, owns the salesperson's calendar. Now, I'm talking about more cost. But in a minute, I'll explain to you how you'll have much fewer salespeople, so the net cost is actually positive, not negative. Or the delta is positive, not negative. But it's important that I impress upon you the magnitude of productivity improvement that this configuration is going to cause. So a capable salesperson working with a capable sales coordinator or executive assistant will perform 10 times the volume of business development appointments. So to achieve the same result in your standard model, what you would have to do is employ 9 more salespeople for every one you currently have. I'm suggesting that an alternative to employing 9 more salespeople for every one you currently have is to employ 1 sales coordinator for every 1 field-based salesperson you currently have. So the rest of the model looks like this. The sales coordinator is essentially a project manager. And the sales coordinator's resource pool then consists of the salesperson here and consists of these technical resources, which includes customer service team members and project leaders. Upstream from the sales coordinator, we have a promotions coordinator. So now I think you can see how the model is starting to work. It's the responsibility of the promotions coordinator to generate sales opportunities. It's the promotion of the sales coordinator to manage those sales opportunities, and as a consequence of managing them, generate appointments for the salesperson. And it's the responsibility of the salesperson to perform those appointments in the field and report back to the sales coordinator with outcomes so that the sales coordinator can schedule the next activity in the opportunity management workflow that we looked at previously. So that's a look at the structure of the model as a whole. The last point that I wanted to talk to is the implications for management. Now, those of you who are engineers, which is I suspect many of you, or those of you who work in or who have had some experience in production environments, which is probably all of you, will start to see that what we've essentially done to sales is what we intended to do. We've industrialized it. And what that means is sales now looks like a production environment, or probably more accurately like a project environment. Now, the upshot of that is that we can now manage this environment scientifically. In other words, we can manage it by numbers. We can bring a quantitative as opposed to a qualitative approach to the management of the sales function. And I want to suggest to you that, interestingly, there are just 2 numbers that you need to watch to manage the performance of the sales function, at least at a macro level. The first is the number of forward book days in the salesperson's calendar. Now, in the fullness of time, it is true that you will probably shift your constraint to production. And when you have done that, you will build a queue of forward orders upstream from production. But until you do that, you had better make sure that you have a queue of appointments upstream from the salesperson, meaning that your salesperson or salespeople are doing 4 appointments a day, 5 days a week, irrespective of variability upstream. In other words, you want to have a big enough queue of forward booked appointments. In other words, your salesperson needs to be booked far enough ahead so that your sales coordinator could have a day off or 2 days off or even 3 days off, and still the salesperson performs 4 appointments a day, 5 days a week. Now you also want to maintain a queue of opportunities upstream from the sales coordinator. So the two critical indicators are how many days worth of forward booked appointments do we have upstream from the salesperson, and how many days worth of pending appointments. In other words, how big is our opportunity queue upstream from the sales coordinator. As senior managers, if you configure your sales function along the lines that I'm advocating here, it is true that you will have a sales manager who looks at more granular data, but the only two numbers that you need to monitor are the size of these queues. Now, probably the most obvious question that I'm going to get in a minute is, well, what do the economics look like? I'm sure you're all thinking, well, your approach, Justin, seems to suggest that we employ a bunch of people. Costs are surely going to go up. So in a second or two, I'm going to show you how costs are actually going to go down in spite of the fact that we're going to double your volume of business development activity. So I'll show you that in a minute. First, I have an offer for you. Now, I know we have a no sales pitch guarantee in this webinar, but the interesting thing about this offer is that it's for free, so it's a service rather than a sales pitch, or at least that's my rationalization. So the offer is that you and I, or more correctly, you and your senior team is probably a better use of all of our time, or of your team's time, dedicate 40 minutes in a conference call to exploring the implications of this approach to your sales function. So here's what I'm suggesting. So I'm suggesting 5 steps. The first one is prior to the conference call. So my first suggestion is that you read the first 5 chapters of The Machine. You'll get a link to them in an email afterwards. And anyone else who'd like to participate in the call, have them read the first 5 chapters of The Machine as well, so that we don't have to spend time on the phone reviewing the basics. The second thing that we do once we get on the conference call is we review a typical day in the life of a salesperson, and if you have inside sales or customer service, we review a typical day in each of their lives as well. We can discover an awful lot about the structure and the operation of your sales function just by reviewing a day in the life of each of the operators. Once we've done that, we'll take some time to discuss your current sales structure and your current resourcing model. And then as we go, I'll see if I can point to some easy wins, some simple changes that you can make in the short term to produce some enormous improvements. And in almost every case, it's possible for me to do that. And of course, what we'll spend the balance of the call talking about is, well, if we started with a clean sheet of paper and engineered your sales function from scratch, how would it look? So that's kind of a thought experiment, and it's a fun one. So if you're interested in doing that, there's no charge. Simply select yes on this poll here. Now, if you select yes, Charlene, my assistant, will send you an email with some dates, and you can pick the date and the time that suits you best, and we're up and away. So I'll leave this up for about 5 seconds, and then I'll take it down. So yes, if you're interested in seeing some dates, no if you're not. 5 seconds, 4, 3, 2, I'll put it back up at the end. Now we're on with the rest of the presentation. Okay, so what do the economics look like? I'm going to suggest that we imagine a typical organization with 10 salespeople. Okay, what would the model that I've described to you look like with respect to resourcing and with respect to activity levels? So here's the thing. If we went into a typical organization that had 10 salespeople, we would reduce the field sales team to 2. And there's a very simple reason for that, and I've mentioned it already. In our model, one salesperson could do the same volume of appointments as 10. But we don't want to maintain the same number of appointments. If we just maintain the same number of appointments, then this becomes nothing more than a cost-saving exercise. We want to increase the appointment volume. Now, to increase your appointment volume by 10 times would be preposterous. Almost certainly, engineering and production couldn't keep up with that, and you may start to discover that the market simply isn't large enough to generate that volume of appointments, at least not in the short term. So what we've found a sensible rule of thumb is to look to increase your volume of business development appointments by 100%. In other words, double your opportunity flow. So count the number of appointments you're doing currently, multiply it by 2. That's the number of appointments you should be doing in the near future. That's achievable. Anything more than that isn't. Then divide that number by 20, and that tells you how many salespeople you need. Now, 10 salespeople today will be doing 20 appointments a week. You want to double that to 40. To generate 40 appointments a week, you need two salespeople. So that's how many salespeople we will have in this model here, two. We're going to take four of your existing salespeople and turn them into project leaders, because two salespeople will be able to prosecute so many opportunities that they will need four project leaders to manage the technical component of both sales and production. Now, this is assuming this is a technical environment. We're going to provide each of your field-based salespeople with a sales coordinator. Now, these numbers here may not be true to your region. If you're in Sydney, the numbers are going to be very much on the low side. If you're in Montana or Argentina, perhaps they're very much on the high side, but they are still relative. In other words, scale them up or down, and it will still turn out to be true. So two sales coordinators. Now, because we're taking all customer service away from sales and centralizing it in the customer service team, I'm assuming here that we're adding 4 people to the customer service team, which is fairly generous. So the consequence of these changes is that we've actually decreased payroll significantly by $250,000 a year, while simultaneously doubling the volume of field appointments a week. So my expectation is, or my experience is, this configuration will double the volume of sales appointments, it will reduce costs, and it will simultaneously increase significantly your customer service quality for two reasons. One is we now have a proper, robust internal customer service function, and number two is we actually have two project leaders for every salesperson, meaning that if it's a technical sales environment, we have technical people who do nothing other than chaperone orders through the production process, which has an enormous impact on delivery quality and customer satisfaction. Okay. Now, the interesting point about doubling your volume of sales opportunities is that that number for a reasonable sized firm is achievable without spending an additional cent on promotion. The reason for that is, in an organization of this size, there are opportunities that are currently being neglected because salespeople are too busy doing customer service, and there are existing accounts that are not being visited at the optimal frequency. So my experience is, in a mid-sized firm, we can double the volume of business development appointments without spending a cent on promotion, meaning that the uplift that we're talking about here, you can realistically experience in a very, very short time horizon. The remaining slide I have for you shows you graphically the couple of metrics that management should be using to manage the sales function once it's up and running. So that's all I have for you now. I've gone about 7 minutes over time. My apologies for that. And I'm so happy that you've all been able to stay around. I guess it means that there's some value in this for you, which is great. So I am out of time. If there are questions, put them in the chat room or put your hand up and I'll give you audio. But I don't expect you to stay around any longer. I will send you a recording of this event in half an hour or so. So all there is to say now is thank you for attending, and let me wish you the greatest success implementing this in your organizations. Thank you again for joining me, and I'll put that offer up on the screen again. Thank you. Thank you all. Thank you, Isabel. Thank you all. Mark, did you have a question? Just in case you did, I will give you voice. If you did, you can go ahead and ask it. Thank you, Alejandro. Thank you for coming. It's a long way from Colombia. Mark, if you're trying to talk, there's probably a pop-up on your screen asking permission from Flash. Just click yes and your microphone will work. If not, type your question in the chat window. Alejandro, oh, you're from Ecuador. My apologies. I assumed you were from Colombia. Uh, our preference is that salespeople's salaries are constant. So in other words, we pay salespeople salaries rather than commissions, and the reason for that is very simple, and that's because we're building a team-based approach to selling. So if you think about a production environment, performance pay was eliminated in production with the advent of division of labor because we no longer wanted salespeople to we no longer wanted production people to pursue local optima. In other words, we never wanted individuals to pursue peak output. We wanted to design the environment as a whole for peak output. The same thing applies in sales. If we have a group of people working together as a team to originate and generate sales opportunities, it ceases to be possible to say this person generated a sale. So if it's not possible to say this person generated a sale, it no longer makes sense to compensate individuals based upon an implicit assumption that they made the sale. I know in our case, if we add a new client, the total volume of work performed, uh, um, the greater majority of that is performed by Charlene, my assistant, not by me. I zoom in and do um, appointments as they've been scheduled or run workshops. But Charlene is the one who does most of the spade work. I'm sure she'd be quite insulted if I was getting paid commissions and she was being paid a salary. So yeah, we pay salespeople their market value. Interestingly, that gives management more control. If you pay salespeople commission, it's up to them what they do with their time. If you're paying them a salary, you actually get to determine how their time gets deployed.